Welcome to How to Fix It. I'm John Avlon, author, journalist, historian, and the challenges facing American democracy today are the stuff of the Founding Fathers' nightmares. The Founding Fathers warned us about the dangers of a demagogue. They talked about the dangers of a demagogue trying to move our country towards tyranny. And my next guest has spent most of his career studying democracies at home and abroad. And he is urgently concerned about what he calls the authoritarian project that Donald Trump is imposing or trying to impose on America. Larry Diamond, author, Hoover Institution fellow, has made the case that urgency is imperative. He makes the case in our conversation that the American people need to stand up to support those who are being isolated and attacked, that we need to find courage to defend our Constitution, that we need to combat the chaos and cruelty and corruption of the administration, and that we need to do so with an inclusive, positive, patriotic movement that advances the values of freedom and the flag and faith and family in the most expansive sense, that we need to respond with strength and confidence and optimism, despite the dark tenor of these times. Many of you have asked, what can we do? What can I do? I hope this conversation with Larry Diamond helps answer that question. Larry, welcome to How to Fix It.
Thank you, John. That's very kind of you.
Well, it has the added advantage of being true. I want to get your take on a quote that really struck me from Lee Bollinger. He gave an interview to the Chronicle of Higher Education. He's the former longtime president of Columbia University, First Amendment lawyer, previously head of University of Michigan Law School. And he said in no uncertain term, we're in the midst of an authoritarian takeover of the U.S. government. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's obvious. Trump, as I warned in the Foreign Affairs article shortly after Trump was elected last November, I think he's made his authoritarian intentions quite plain. He ended his last presidency with an attempted authoritarian takeover of the government by trying to nullify the election. And you just look at every step he's taken to take over institutions, to unleash a technocratic brown shirt squad on one government agency after another, to violate the Constitution's assignment of the power to appropriate money to the Congress and not the president, to close down institutions without congressional certification, to terrorize individuals and law firms as he's doing. He violated a court order very recently by deporting 200 Venezuelans when the court ordered the planes not to take off or to turn back. It's just one thing after another. And there's a clear plan here. It's much better organized than last time. And there's an ideology behind it more clearly than last time, and a philosophy of government, which I know you're familiar with, called the unitary executive. Another word for that is the imperial presidency, and another word for that is the authoritarian presidency.
All those examples you gave are frankly, you could have added others. I mean, the defunding of, Voice of America, the assault on National Endowment for Democracies, which you had previously been a part of, the apparent aligning with Vladimir Putin against Ukraine, the undermining of our democratic allies. But one of the points you make in studying how other countries have successfully combated, which you have called previously the democratic recession globally, is that resistance is more effective when mobilized early. Because the longer that authoritarians hold on to power, the more they chip away at institutional constraints. We are not even at 100 days. There are a lot of frustrations and questions people feel as to what is the right way to mobilize a principled opposition. Let's talk about what you believe people can do now with elections for midterms more than 18 months away. What can people do now, and why is speed necessary?
Authoritarians always seek to intimidate and isolate pockets of opposition. The essence of defeating authoritarianism is coordination. large-scale mobilization and coordination among individuals who might lack courage if they're isolated, but gather courage by unity of action. And if you isolate people and pick them off one by one, so we can talk about the assault on law firms, which is really an assault on the rule of law in the United States. And starting with Perkins Coie and now the law firm Paul Weiss, and I think there's been at least one other. If you try to pick them off one by one and then all the others say, okay, those guys, they can't go into federal buildings anymore. They can't do business with the federal government anymore. Okay, they'll be destroyed, but we'll be okay. And you don't stand up for the profession of the law and resist the violation of the rule of law that this represents, then the authoritarian project gains momentum and everyone starts cowering in fear. You spoke about Lee Bollinger, the extremely forthright former president of Columbia University. Columbia University is now being picked off the way the law firm Perkins Coie has been. And you know about the $400 million suspension in federal funding. If universities don't stand up collectively and say, no, this is wrong, this is a violation of the spirit of democracy and the rule of law, and we are not going to allow anyone among us to be bullied and intimidated in this way, and we're going to mobilize the Congress, civil society, and the American people, not to mention the courts, to stand up to this, the authoritarian project succeeds in getting everyone to obey. And it's very important, I know you're familiar with this, John, to recall the first principle of Tim Snyder's brilliant essay on tyranny, which is do not obey in advance. And the broader principle is do not offer gratuitous obeisance and obedience to an authoritarian project. People have to come together and resist.
What does that look like as a practical matter for other law firms, for businesses, for other universities? I mean, they can say we stand in solidarity, but what does it look like in practice for them? What's their to-do list?
I think then you have to look at what are the arenas of resistance to this kind of project. The Congress ought to be one. And unfortunately, the Congress, under the current Republican leadership and in the current political dynamic in the United States, which you know so well as a former and I hope future candidate for Congress, they have simply tucked their tails between their legs and run away. I think it's unfortunate. I actually think there is potentially a daring strategy to turn the Congress around politically. We could come to that. Pressure needs to be brought to bear on members of Congress, and particularly Republicans who we know in their hearts would like to do the right thing, but who lack the courage right now to do so. Then you come to the courts. I think the courts right now are our most hopeful arena for action. They have been issuing a lot of injunctions and temporary restraining orders. And we're already seeing signs even in the Supreme Court with the vote of John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett against Trump in a significant case, at least halting one Trump authoritarian move. That he may not have the reliable court majority he thinks he has. Now, the ultimate test, John, will be if Trump defies not a lower court ruling, but a Supreme Court ruling, which J.D. Vance has been trumpeting as, Trump's legitimate right to do, that the court can't interfere with Trump's legitimate power. But of course, under our democratic constitution, it is the job of the Supreme Court to decide what Trump's legitimate power is and what the limits of it are. Beyond the courts, there's civil society, and there's mass mobilization, and there's protests of various kinds.
And what do you think are the most effective ways for citizens to bring that pressure to bear? Is it mass protests? Is it flooding, your congressman's, inbox and phone calls with, and town halls, should they hold them, which in many cases they don't? Not with chain letters, but individual letters. I mean, what is the right way, you think, looking at what's happened in other nations, for that to have an effect? And then I want to get to the constitutional crisis promise that has been made in effect. But let's just flesh that out for folks who are listening.
Individual citizens can donate money to organizations that are fighting this battle, particularly in the courts. Organizations like Protect Democracy, Democracy Forward, the Brennan Center, Public Citizen, and others that are filing these lawsuits. They can and should make their voice heard in town hall meetings, in other government sessions, particularly Republican members of Congress and senators need to hear from their constituents, mail, phone, town hall meetings if they're daring enough to hold them. Donors to these candidates need to speak up. Businesses, both in local districts and nationally, need to come together. I favor consumer boycotts. We're already starting to see one against Tesla. And I think that big corporations that are eagerly, if not greedily, participating in this looting of the constitutional order should face real economic pressure in the form of declining sales and in the form of sales of their stock by people who just say no. The ultimate way this is going to be defeated, is in elections. And we have to start preparing for that, but we can't wait for that.
You mentioned J.D. Vance's repeated promise of a constitutional crisis. Now, this is someone who's a Yale Law School graduate, part of this sort of Ivy League, populist or tradical crew. And he is quoted, I think out of context, Andrew Jackson saying to Justice Marshall, "I've read the justice's opinion. Now I invite him to enforce it." There are other versions of this through history from not American folks who say, I wonder how many divisions the Pope has. The point is, though, in the realm of the courts, there is no enforcement mechanism for the courts other than our Constitution, which unfortunately needs to be said with a degree of irony, and democratic norms, which are actively being eroded. It may be that Coney Barrett and Justice Roberts hold. A lot of the republic seems to hang with them and their integrity. But we've already seen Donald Trump disregard a decision of the Supreme Court. He did it the day before his second inauguration with regard to TikTok. And there's been no follow through on that. Now, that doesn't raise the prospect of the constitutional crisis that J.D. Vance seems to be contemplating. But if the administration actively disregards a Supreme Court decision and says, who's going to enforce it? We've got the U.S. Marshals. We've got the military in effect. What does that look like within the context of a civil society? What is the right civil society response to this? Because we got to make very clear, political violence should always be rejected, but especially in a context like this, any intimation of political violence or protests that turn into riots creates a pretext for the Insurrection Act, which they've also teased as something that's very much on their menu.
Well, let me say, first of all, that people should have a look at the New York Times op-ed by two NYU law professors, Trevor Morrison and Richard Pildes last month. The courts do have some instruments to enforce their rulings with findings of civil contempt, potential fines of people who disobey. They could even order federal marshals to send people to jail. Now, Trump controls the federal marshals, so they probably wouldn't act. But all this builds up the necessary confrontation between the rule of law and the authoritarian project. And if that reaches the Supreme Court and they defy the Supreme Court, I think that is the point at which we have crossed the line into authoritarianism. And there needs to be, as you suggested, large-scale protests in the streets and really massive pressure on members of Congress. And that is perhaps the moment for some members of Congress who are, I think, continually thinking, okay, I'll vote for this nomination. I'll fold on the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard. I'll fold on the nomination of Pete Hegseth. But when there's a true break glass moment, that'll be the last straw for me. And if these people, like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and John Curtis of Utah and some others really reach that break glass moment, you have to ask yourself, what might they do to resist the pressure? And I think there is an interesting pathway that the Democratic Party and American civil society should offer to them, particularly when they're coming, as many of them are, from red states like Utah, Louisiana, and Alaska. I don't think the Democrats are going to win a Senate seat in Alaska. But of course, the reason why Lisa Murkowski can be so courageous is because Alaska is the only state that has both a nonpartisan primary and ranked choice voting, which is where we need to go in the United States. That's the ultimate solution.
100%.
But the pathway would be don't play their game. Don't yield to their intimidation. They say, Elon Musk says, vote for Hegseth, or I'm going to pour $20 million into a political action committee to defeat you in the next Republican primary. The proper response to that is, fine, go ahead. I'll run as an independent. I'll meet you in the general election. I think, after all, Angus King is an independent from Maine. Now, he did run in the Democratic primary, but they could go straight to the general election as an independent. And if the Democrats are smart enough not to mount a serious campaign in a deep red state, they could instruct their voters, look, let this more courageous Republican pick up the principled Republicans, the independents, and the Democrats, and form the kind of coalition that is necessary to stop this madness.
I completely agree. That's something I've argued in columns in the past, that if Bob Corker, for example, had decided to run as an independent, that you get 4 or 5 independents in the Senate, and that's what's sometimes
that's all you need.
The fulcrum strategy. That's right.
Yeah, and then they could take control of the Senate, Lisa Murkowski or some other more moderate Republican could become the Senate majority leader. A moderate Republican could become the speaker, and because you're just a few seats short in the House as well, and you could be in a very different situation where the Congress is now saying no instead of being a rubber stamp.
I'm in radical agreement with everything you've said, but I do think that scenario is worth contemplating right now. And you make the point. I mean, look, the fact that senators have been threatened, and I've spoken to a senator about this, who said that, if folks are up certainly in the next 2 cycles, that they're being told you're going to be primaried by Elon Musk's money. you need to find a way to judo move that, and you just laid that out. The other thing you point out is that corruption is an Achilles heel of any authoritarian adjacent regime, and now that requires investigations, if not, and it requires a free press, which is in the process of being intimidated. I'm very concerned about the dangers of media capture, a la Orban. But another thing people can do is support their local, and not only local, support news organizations, subscribe to news organizations that are doing it right, that aren't being cowed, that have the capacity for investigative work. But talk about those sort of levers that have been pulled successfully, because there's no constituency for corruption, I guess, except for the kleptocrats who benefit from it.
The ultimate penalty for gross, systemic, greedy corruption, which all these authoritarian projects, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, and obviously Chavez and now Maduro in Venezuela and so on, drench themselves in, because there are no checks and balances. And then human nature being what it is, why not make you, yourself, and your party and your support community wealthy beyond imagination? So inevitably, this becomes a necessary part of the campaign against this project, because people don't like corruption. And the right-wing illiberal populist rode to power with a narrative against corruption. So it's not just corruption that we're trying to expose and mobilize against. It's the hypocrisy of having denounced it and then become what they denounced. And if you don't have an independent media to research that and document that, then you're in trouble. John, I'm not worried that we're going to lose the ability of media to investigate and expose this. I think we're a big enough country with a pluralistic enough media so that it will be documented and exposed. I'm worried about having the means through instruments like what we are doing right now to convey this to the American people in a way that they will absorb and rise up against. I wish your podcast a great deal of success, but we need to elevate it and others like it to have wider listenerships, and we need to get to ordinary middle Americans in red states and districts so that they become more acutely aware of the fraud that has been imposed upon them by this corruption and hypocrisy.
You're speaking about not media capture in the classic sense, but algorithmic obedience.
Yeah, and algorithmic fragmentation and the inferior agility and narrative of the kind of democratic with the small d side of the political spectrum. We have not had the style, the reach, the strategy, the narrative that the Joe Rogans of the world have had, and we have some work to do in that regard.
Joe Rogan was a Bernie Sanders supporter at one point. You can get into the horseshoe theory of it all, but you make the point that one of the things authoritarian populists do is they take advantage of when basic things like borders or personal security or economic security aren't being tended to adequately, that's an opening. But you also point out, and this is one of the key points that I took from your essay about, it was a pre-election essay about how to end the democratic recession. But you point out there are consistent characteristics of successful pro-democracy movements. First of all, it is a unifying, broad message that invites even former supporters of the regime in. We seek to unite the nation, not divide it. You got to show empathy and humility, being welcoming, culturally and ethnic and ideological diverse members of society to join the cause, but also that we should recapture patriotism and present strength to show people that just being a strong man is not the only way to be strong and optimistic and not boring, not dour. Talk about how those characteristics, which I completely identify with, are necessary to building a successful pro-democracy movement.
Well, the unity element, first of all, means that the Democratic Party needs to get its act together. It suffered a pretty grievous split over Schumer's decision to support the continuing resolution to fund the government for the next 6 months.
What do you make of that, given that the argument was that a shutdown would actually enable the authoritarian takeover? Clearly, the messaging was bad. The sequencing was bad. But what do you make of that argument? Self-serving and limited, or farsighted?
Right now, analytically, I don't have a dog in that fight. I think the Democrats were in a horrible situation. I think Schumer made a decision, to fund the continuing resolution because he feared that if the government was shut down, Musk and Trump would have even more power to rampage over the government and shut down agencies and reshape it in their authoritarian image. Schumer made a decision that may have been the wrong decision, may have been the right decision, but he made it honorably. And the key point I would make about that is that even though I'm slightly inclined to side with Patty Murray and the ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee, who was outraged by the decision and felt it was a big mistake and that you said the crisis is now, let's have the confrontation. That was the view of the Democrats. I think Schumer acted out of honorable and possibly correct intent, and that the Democrats should just move on now. They've got to unite their ranks. They do not have the time, the luxury to wallow in bitter recriminations over this. And they need to forge a strategy that has a common voice and clear messaging to focus not on their internal divisions, but on Trump's abuse of the Constitution, his corruption, his arrogance, his betrayal of the American people, the recession that's coming on, the inflation that hasn't been brought down, the gratuitous tariffs that are attacks on the American people. The other point I made there is that where Democratic forces take back politics and turn back an authoritarian project, it's not just with appeals against corruption and condemnations of authoritarian actions. It's with appeal to bread and butter issues that people care about in their pocketbooks. And these autocrats eventually run the economy into the ground through their corruption and their incompetence. That is their soft underbelly, their Achilles heel. And most of all, Democrats have to go after that.
And they need to do it in a confident, patriotic, uniting manner, right? This can't be dour. It needs to be a patriotic, rebellious project. And that's got to welcome people in. I think part of the problem Democrats have seen to be sort of, excluding people versus party purity litmus test. This has got to be the opposite of that.
So, it can't just be political correctness coming from the progressive side of Democrats. I think Alyssa Slotkin, the new senator from Michigan, showed a tone and a way in her response to Trump in Trump's kind of semi-State of the Union address. I think the language that Chris Murphy is finding now and the journey he is on from neoliberalism to a kind of economic patriotism and a new concern to generate jobs in the United States and reach out to people who've been marginalized and betrayed from the working and middle classes by this Trump project. Ro Khanna has been doing a lot of writing and speaking about reviving manufacturing and the technological base of the U.S. These are the kinds of messages I think the Democratic Party needs.
And it needs to be, I'm a big Václav Havel fan, and it needs to be a happy warrior project. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be patriotic. It needs to be strong. And as we close, I want to just see if we can focus on some messaging that you might think be effective. I mean, first of all, I think the admonition people need to hear in their own lives is the old biblical admonition, be not afraid. You cannot allow them to intimidate you. You need to be not afraid. And this is businesses need to straighten their civic backbone. Everyone needs to step up. But if the moment you allow fear to enter your heart and your head, they've already won a critical battle. And I think Adam Kinzinger and other folks have been setting that tone correctly. So we agree, be not afraid, be confident, be strong, get strength from the challenges we face as a country right now. Second is the messaging against the administration. Now, you got to be against something and you got to be for something. But you've pointed out corruption as a key Achilles heel to keep hammering at. It has been suggested that there's a 3 C's that should be invoked: chaos, cruelty, and corruption, and their essential incompetence. You know, this is about really taking those things to task. Does that seem correct to you?
Yes, I think so. The cruelty element focuses on their cavalier disregard for the material concerns and needs, the economic and social security of economically insecure, as I said, working class and middle class voters who they recruited to their cause. Trump, most of all, promising lower prices and a rebirth of economic growth and new manufacturing. And of course, the economy is headed into a recession because of their mismanagement. And we haven't even really seen the cruelty that they're going to embark on when they go after the social safety net. But it's coming. They've gone first against the instruments of America's engagement in the world because they judged with USAID, Voice of America, and so on, that there would be no constituency for those. But you know what's coming. The incompetence you can see every day, and it's making the economic crisis and the crisis of governance worse. The corruption we've talked about. Let's also talk about constitutionalism and their assault on procedures and checks and balances, but ultimately on freedom. Freedom is something every American cares about. Their right not to have the government compel them, their right to speak. And, you know, my colleague at Harvard, Steve Levitsky, with a colleague of his in the political science department, wrote a very important essay in the Harvard Crimson about the assault on Columbia. And the metaphor they used harken back to the Nazi era and that famous adage, you know, first they came for the communists and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't worry. Then they came for the trade unionists and I wasn't a trade unionist and I didn't worry. Then they came for the gays and I wasn't a gay and I didn't worry. And then they came for me and there was nobody left to defend me. And that's the logic of what you were referring to earlier, when people have to act collectively early on, or they'll be picked off one by one. And that's why we need to find courage. It's not just an idealistic thing that we should ask not what our country can do for us, but what we can do for our country and our Constitution in this time of crisis. It's also a practical matter. If you don't stand up now collectively, there'll be nobody to stand up for you later once they've consolidated this authoritarian project.
The second issue you just said is the Constitution and courage. There's another 4 words that has been put forward. They're value words, what we're fighting for, that we need to reclaim as a broader coalition to defend American democracy, because it's bigger than the Democratic Party. Successful pro-democracy movements have to be bigger. It's reclaiming, and you used one of them already, freedom, reclaiming the flag, patriotism, reclaiming faith, that this is a, if you're actually going to do the social gospel movement, if you're going to care about the least of us, that faith-based institutions are important to be welcomed into this tent and put forward. And family. This is also about defending families. There's a spirit of kindness and lifting people up and building a better future. Are those the right values to be animating and inspiring a pro-democracy movement to push back against an authoritarian project?
I think they're good core American values. I think we should have, expansive views about what we mean by family.
Yes.
First of all, quite literally, we have to support working families. There's a great organization called Moms Rising, which has 1 million members, that's been mobilizing for years now to defend working families. You can't say you care about families, which the MAGA movement, of course, is always saying it does, and then shred the elements of support that enable mothers to re-enter the workforce and enable families to have support for childcare and adequate health care for their children. You can't really say you care about families and trash the science that we know protects children from getting measles or even polio. We know how to do this. It's called immunization. And you can't be promoting cockeyed, misinformation about vaccines and say you care about families. And with faith, let's go to, transcendent, not just Christian values, but values that are shared across all the world's great religions that involve human decency. And community is another word you might throw in terms of caring for one another and doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. And the way that Musk and Trump and the MAGA movement are proceeding now is not an affirmation of Christian or Judeo-Christian or unifying values of the faiths that we know and value.
The word values is important too, because this needs to be something that it isn't just about the head. It needs to resonate with the heart. I think people are viscerally starting to get the sense that something is being taken away. Something is being broken. Larry, before we go, I know you've got a big essay you've been working on. Tell people about where what it says and where they can find it.
Well, I've tried in an essay that will be published in the near future on the website of Persuasion in our online magazine edited by Frank Fukuyama, American Purpose, to say, how do we resist? How do we stop this? How do we turn this around? And what can individuals do? Basically goes into greater depth on what we've just talked about, John. And it has a lot of links to sources to document the trouble we're in, and also to organizations that people can hook up with, maybe support financially or get personally involved in. We can't wait until November of 2026, much less November of 2028. We have to be active now. We have to partner now, and we have to find courage together.
Larry Diamond, you have devoted your life to defending democracy, and the time to defend American democracy is right now. Thank you for joining us on How to Fix It.